Welcome to Hub-Bub, the People's Podcast, where we engage our citizens and investors with the activities of the Planning and Code Administration and encourage everyone to contribute to Hagerstown's growth.
Well, welcome again to another edition of the Hub-Bub Podcast. We're in March. The 9th episode. It's gone fast, hasn't it?
It has. 9 episodes in. I can't believe it.
Yeah.
Again, they are keeping us around.
Yeah. Now, you don't need an introduction. I hear he has become famous. People are noticing Donnie Harcum. So,
Sean Brown, it's fine. Everybody's noticing you as well.
I just haven't met him yet.
Exactly.
No. Anyway, but it's a pleasure to be here, Donnie and myself, to talk to you. And, spring is approaching. We're recording today. It's a beautiful day out there. We're thinking about spring.
I know it's some crazy weather out there. Lack of winter, which I'm okay with, but getting some nice weather out there, and I'm really enjoying it.
Yeah. So probably like us, you out there are thinking about plans for the lawn and a garden, that kind of thing. I know you bought a home.
I did, yeah, and there's definitely some yard work that needs to be done. It's first time being a homeowner.
Yeah.
So taking that all on as a responsibility is exciting, and a lot of work to be done though. So.
Yeah. Got any plans for the yard in the future, garden? Or?
I'm sure my wife has some gardening plans, but as of right now, just mainly starting it out fresh as my own.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, ease into it, I'm sure.
Yes.
Yeah, and having been in a few different places, I can appreciate that. I've had big yards where I had a lot to maintain and cut, large garden, and now I live in a small townhouse, very small backyard, so half my backyard is basically raised bed gardens, and I'm really having fun with that. So I'm thinking about that, like many people, which really ties in with what we're going to be talking about in our podcast today. I think that, and I'm sure you'll agree, everyone that's listening to this podcast today will be able to relate in one way or another.
Definitely, yeah. Everybody probably at some point in their life has had a lawn.
Yeah.
In their life, so.
Yeah. So for some, it's a hobby.
Mm-hmm.
It's exercise. People say, I cut my grass, I mow, I push it even when it's big because I like the exercise. But then for others, cutting grass is more of a nuisance.
Exactly.
It's a waste of time.
You're right.
So, yeah, and don't we see that in our communities? You can go in any given neighborhood just about, and you can find a stark contrast. You can have one yard that's very nicely manicured. It's obvious the people invest a lot of money, and then right beside it, there may be a yard that, let's just say, needs some attention.
Exactly. Yeah, there's some that take a lot of pride in their own yard. And like you said, there's some that could definitely use some work.
Yes. And so we understand that. We respect that everybody has different likes and things when it comes to even their lawns and taking care of that. However, as it leads to our topic today, we're talking about grass and weeds, and specifically how we can kind of maintain that balance, because we all have to live together, right? And so we want to be able to live together as harmoniously as possible. And today we're going to discuss basically the regulations as it pertains to Hagerstown. And as we always say, in many cases we'll be talking about things that are specific to Hagerstown, but in many cases the same rules apply in just about every community. So again, if you want to know what the specific regulations are, if you live outside, for example, the city of Hagerstown, check your local municipal government and see what those regulations are. But, I thought it was interesting as we were preparing for this, there was some research that was put together. It's an interesting history about lawn care and where did it all begin. And so when we look at the word lawn, basically it's referring to a managed grass space. It's a lawn that's maintained. It's cut, it's mowed like with the gardens and parks, or something that's maybe obvious to that we didn't think about. Look at cemeteries. They always keep them, for the most part, very well manicured. Adds to the dignity of it, right? Yeah. So we can respect the idea that when lawns are maintained, it just has a dignified appearance. So, but it's interesting how that the caring for lawns really goes way back to around the 16th century. And what they realized is that they needed to have some delineation in suburban expansions and aesthetics, and it really was, they realized very early on that having a nicely manicured lawn was really a nice interaction with the natural environment to separate spaces and so forth. And in many suburban areas, it's not unusual, even going way back, there were codes or bylaws in place for houses and homes to have lawns that required proper maintenance and certain regulations with those lawns. So we're not talking about something that's just in the past few years. It's been around for a very, very long time. And sometimes there are water shortages. Mm-hmm. And so people, naturally, they invest in a lot of money in their lawns, thousands and thousands of dollars, and they want to continue to maintain that. So governments have often come up with various ways to be able to reduce water use and still help maintain lawns. But when we think about lawns, the way they originated, they all go all the way back to some medieval times and settlements, and they were used as communal areas for grazing of livestock, again, to kind of delineate their area from other areas. And what's interesting is that there are low grasses, and they were kept low back in those early times, in the times of aristocracy, because what they did is they helped even the animals to maintain a certain area. They knew to go to this point. And in Northern Europe and the Middle Ages, they became very popular. And they wanted to be able to distinguish their palace grounds and mansion grounds from the fields. And we can understand that. And then even before the invention of mowing machines in 1830, lawns were managed very differently. I thought that was interesting.
It is very interesting. Just the fact that, I never would have thought in the medieval times that people cared about their lawns, but it makes a lot of sense as to why they did care at that point. So
yeah, and not even realizing how long mowing machines have been around. So, but even before that, as we know and we've seen historically, there have always been wealthy estates and these large manor houses. And before they had mowing machines, they had to use other methods. That didn't mean they didn't cut their grass before they had machines. There were methods, for example, scything. I looked up some YouTube videos on scything. It's amazing. It's labor intensive, but they have competitions.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and so though it's labor intensive, you go on YouTube, it's faster than mowing.
Wow.
There's a guy on there, one guy who sets a record. He cuts 11-foot wide swath in one sweep.
Wow.
So I think he cut over 400 square feet in 2 minutes.
Jeez.
Yeah.
So a little bit more work.
A lot more work. These guys are in shape. And I might add that there were females doing the same thing.
Great.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I'll have to check that out.
Yeah. So, but they did it all for very, very important reasons. They even used animals. There are a lot of breeds of animals that will naturally eat the grass real close to the ground. And so, just helps us to see that this type of lawn care goes way, way back. And then even front lawns, they became standardized in the 1930s. And this ongoing maintenance of lawn became really, really popular then. But of course, when the Depression came on in the 30s and then World War II, now they had to kind of refocus their efforts. And not so much because of the war that was affecting a lot of the world with the Depression and so forth. And then because the states relied on Europe to provide the seed, well, that wasn't so much available. So that kind of fell by the wayside. But then as time went on, there were other companies that became more prominent that we've heard of, like Scott's, Miracle-Gro, and they stepped up to be able to help. And really, it was a combined effort to help families to continue to maintain their lawns. And really, it was kind of like a public relations thing to encourage hey, get out in your lawns, cultivate it. It's stress relief.
Right.
Expend some energy. So I thought that was pretty interesting as well. What's interesting as well is, and we'll talk about this later on, is that when you think about those early times, because grasses could get so tall, what would happen is that, say, an invading army or something was approaching the manor. Well, all they have to do is hide in the tall grass.
Right.
They could get right up to the building or the home. So that was one of the reasons that they would cut the grass so that they could look out and see if anybody was approaching.
That's pretty smart. Again, something I never even thought of.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. When there's wars and there's troops, how do they sneak in a lot of times to be unseen? Through the tall grass.
Exactly.
Right?
Yep.
Right. So they had something in mind with that. So we recognize that maintaining a lawn, that can be subjective, and there are terms that are associated with how a lawn is maintained. For example, perhaps you've heard of a rough cut. Maybe we've heard of that. A rough cut means it's kind of cut high, and it only needs really occasional cutting. And in some areas, people just may use animals too. But then there's a fine cut, which most, when you see companies going around and manicuring lawns, they're doing that nice fine cut, for aesthetics. But nonetheless, whatever the case, sometimes what people will find in their situation is that because maybe they don't give as much attention to their lawn as maybe others around them, then they may find themselves kind of subject to the social pressure.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. You see your neighbor mowing. It's like, might want to get out there and do that soon.
Yeah. Or the neighbor might be having a chat with you. Hey,
Exactly.
Have you thought about giving your lawn some attention? Right. But, it varies from area to area, the amount of attention the lawn needs. Around here, on average, as we see with our area, maybe a week you could go without cutting it. Maybe a little longer if you don't get much rain.
It does depend on that rainfall.
Yeah. So anyway, just an ongoing thing.
I agree. That is very interesting. I'm a big baseball fan, so with baseball season here, fresh cut grass, just adds to the whole season of it. So
yeah.
I'm ready for some baseball and some fresh cut grass.
All right.
All right, so judging by our history, you can kind of see why we have ordinance for lawn management. Believe it or not, the city of Hagerstown is not the first one to come up with these ordinances or codes or bylaws, as you mentioned. That was used way back when. And currently, jurisdictions could have independent ordinances to address the height limitation for grass, or they may have adopted property maintenance or livability codes with a code section stating the height limitation of grass in the local jurisdiction. So locally here in Hagerstown, all lots are to be maintained free from weeds in excess of 10 inches, and that is through the growing season. Weeds are defined as all grasses, annual plants, and vegetation other than trees, shrubs, or cultivated flowers in gardens, and all noxious weeds are prohibited. So what's the difference between a noxious weed and an overgrown lawn? I'm sure most people will know that overgrown lawns are when the lawn gets to a height that the local jurisdictions determine is too high. Our local elected officials give us a standard, and that is what we enforce. There's no set standard across the country for maximum height, so it is up to your local jurisdiction. And what is a noxious weed? They are plants that are injurious to agricultural or horticultural crops, natural habitats or ecosystems, or humans or livestock. Most noxious weeds have been introduced into an ecosystem by ignorance or mismanagement or by accident. Some noxious weeds are native. Typically, they are plants that grow aggressively, multiply quickly, without natural, and display adverse effects through contact or ingestion. And noxious weeds are a large problem in many parts of the world. They greatly affect areas of agriculture, forest management, nature reserves, parks, and other open space. So definitely not a good look if you got some of those noxious weeds in your area.
That's very true, and that's good because it doesn't seem like it's a big thing maybe if you've never experienced it, but in many areas of the country where there are noxious weeds and they haven't been controlled, they get out of control, and then it can be hard or impossible to rein it back in because it's so widespread. That word noxious weeds, it's kind of a broad term too. As you talked about, it can mean a number of things with the type of thing. It's interesting also when you think about what we've talked about earlier, even when it applies to weeds and maintaining yards and things like that. In many cases, we fall under federal guidelines. In other words, the federal government says sometimes to states, you need to do these things. And so we're mandated to do that. And that's the same with this when it comes to noxious weeds. And we can go all the way back to the time of President Gerald Ford. where he signed the Federal Noxious Weed Act of 1974. Who'd have thought that? Right?
Who would have thought?
Yeah. So it was enacted in January 3rd, 1975. Just to give us a little bit of history of kind of where we are and why we are today is what we're talking about here, just to kind of see how we came to be with noxious weeds, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But really, to what you were saying, this act was created to control the spread of noxious weeds. And so the United States Secretary of Agriculture was given the authority to declare plants noxious weeds and to limit their spread without a permit. And the Secretary also has the authority to really do things like inspect, can even seize, and destroy quarantine areas where necessary to limit these things. That's how serious it is. Now, in 1990, that act was amended. Some further requirements on November 28, 1990. And what this amendment required was that each federal land management agency, and that includes the Bureau of Land Management, the National Park Service, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the U.S. Forest Service, they were required to do the following. And I'm just going to read them. It says they are to designate an office or person adequately trained in managing undesirable plant species, to develop and coordinate a program to control such plants on the agency's land. They are to establish and adequately fund this plant management program through the agency's budget process. They are to complete and implement cooperative agreements or requirements for which are provided with the states regarding undesirable plants on agency land, and establish integrated management systems as defined in the Act to control or contain undesirable plants targeted under the cooperative agreements. So that's a lot of jargon maybe, but basically the mandate is that, hey, you need to watch out for these things, keep them under control, manage them, whatever means necessary. And then that act was superseded by another amendment in 2000 by the Plant Protection Act. And on June 20, 2000, aside from the introductory section of that, this amendment basically was the Plant Protection Act. And what that did is it provided the Secretary of the Department of Agriculture that they can or they may issue regulations to, quote, to prevent the introduction of plant pests into the United States or the dissemination of plant pests within the United States. So often we'll see that. Sometimes we'll hear it on the news where somebody tries to bring in something from another country, food, an animal, even plants, and they may not be allowed to because of this act. And so nice checks and balances there.
Definitely. And that is interesting, especially like you said earlier, if you've never been involved with noxious weeds and never lived in an area where it has affected you, you may not know anything about this, but it's good to know that there are people out there that do care about it and are protecting our land.
Yeah, and oftentimes, sometimes a person might plant something, but they don't realize it's detrimental to other plants or species, and so that's a huge impact too.
Very good point. So as always, check with your local jurisdiction or state for identifying a noxious weed. Here in Maryland, the Maryland General Assembly enacted the first nuisance weed law on Johnson grass in 1969. Prior to the federal law we just mentioned, in 1975 and 79, this law was amended. In 1984, the law was repealed, revised, and consolidated with the thistle control law. In 1987, the nuisance weed law was rewritten and renamed the Noxious Weed Law. The multiflora rose management law became effective on July 1st, 1982. So there's some background on some Maryland nuisance weed laws. The Maryland Noxious Weed Control Program is part of the Plant Protection and Weed Management section at the Maryland Department of Agriculture. I never knew that existed, but there we have it. The purpose of this program is to control and eradicate designated noxious weeds in order to reduce their economic and aesthetic impact on farmers and landowners. Some of these noxious weeds, such as Johnson grass, shatter cane, thistles, can cause losses in excess of $25 million annually to Maryland agriculture due to reduced yields, decline in quality of crops and forages, and increased control costs. Increased expenses are also incurred for roadside and non-crop property management. I had no idea that these noxious weeds could have such an impact, economically. That's wild.
Yeah, it is.
Current prohibited noxious weeds, per the Maryland Noxious Weed Control Law, are as following: Johnson grass, shatter cane, Canada thistle, musk thistle, plumeless thistle, and bull thistle. And within the last decade, Palmer amaranth has become one of the most serious weed pests in the southern and midwestern United States. This invasive weed first became a problem in Maryland approximately 6 to 7 years ago. Initially is limited to the lower areas of the Eastern Shore in southern Maryland. Palmer amaranth has rapidly spread throughout the shore in southern Maryland into areas of central Maryland. So it sounds like it's coming this way a little bit. The problem being that this noxious weed is not on the current list of noxious weeds in Maryland. The only way a noxious weed can be added is through the Maryland General Assembly. And that is until this last year. It passed the House Bill 808. The governor signed House Bill 808 into law and became effective on October 1st, 2019. So we gave you a lot of history there on how it has come to this day, with these weeds, but it's still being worked up to last year. People are still thinking about this, so it's not being forgotten. And this law gave the Secretary of Agriculture in Maryland the authority to add a noxious weed to the list mentioned a little bit ago after an investigation, study, determination, and public hearing on a noxious weed that is adversely affecting or threatening agricultural production. After this, the Secretary can then carry out practices necessary to bring about control or abatement of the noxious species. And this also allows the Secretary to react to a noxious weed situation as needed and not go through the process to change a state law. So it gives the Secretary a lot more hands-on, a little bit more direct impact for these noxious weeds.
Yeah. So we're talking about the state of Maryland having this authority, but then, of course, with each locality, as an example, the city of Hagerstown we live in, our situation may be unique as opposed to other cities, even in Maryland, or, of course, in other parts of the United States.
Definitely.
And they recognize that, so that's why they give local jurisdictions, leeway to develop, more detailed plans when it comes to dealing with noxious weeds. And that perhaps helps those listening in the community understand kind of how laws work, that, there's latitude to a certain extent, but then now local government now has to say, okay, what is our community like? And now tailor these codes and regulations to fit the area. And so the same thing is done with the nuisance weeds. We have specific challenges with the city of Hagerstown. So our locally elected officials, they're the one that adopt the codes that we enforce as a department that are specific to our jurisdiction. And so basically what it boils down to is that when a lawn becomes a nuisance, then the jurisdiction can step in and correct it if that is needed. So we talked earlier about noxious weeds and we've talked about nuisances, but let's focus in a little bit on that area of nuisances. What's a nuisance? Well, sometimes I'm told I'm a nuisance.
Sometimes.
Yeah, but so I know what they're talking about, but anyway. But nuisance weeds, could be a nuisance lawn, something that isn't taken care of. Now, nationally, kind of on average, even though it can vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, averages anywhere from 6 inches at its lowest to 12 inches in more urban settings. In rural areas, maybe higher. But what about Hagerstown? Kind of what we've talked about the history of kind of national things. Now, with the city of Hagerstown, what has the history been? Well, the first ordinance for weeds was in 1965. And at that time, the maximum height limit for weeds was 12 inches. And even at that time, the city had the ability and the right to abate weeds. So in other words, if someone didn't cut their grass or their lot, the city could, after legal notice, go in and cut the grass to abate the problem. And then it passed, that is the city of Hagerstown, passed local noxious weed ordinance in 1982, which was of the 1981 Boca Code, We talked about this in the past with the BOCA code. That was an older code years ago. There were a number of codes that were in place, and it was a little more cumbersome for engineers and architects and even local code enforcement to navigate. So what happened is in around 1999, these codes, including the BOCA code, were eliminated, and then ICC came on the scene, and in 2000 they adopted the ICC IBC code. So it basically condensed all these things into one, just made it easier to navigate and help jurisdictions as well. And in 1992, the city adopted the 1990 BOCA, and the BOCA at that time set the standard at 10 inches. And then 2003, ICC left it up to the local jurisdictions, but in Hagerstown, we continued to adopt and kept it at 10 inches as well, which is what it is now. So we've talked about nuisance as far as kind of the scenario, the situation of lawns and weeds, but what is a nuisance weed? Well, in the city of Hagerstown, we define a nuisance weed as any condition or use of premises or property, which includes the public right-of-way, which is detrimental to the property of others, or which causes or tends to cause substantial diminution. I always miss that word. Anyway, devalues the value of the property in the neighborhood in which the premises are located. So specifically pertaining to weeds, it can include but not limited to uncontrolled weeds, grasses, or other vegetation commonly referred to as weeds. Again, whether it's on private property or the right-of-way. And that can include uncontrolled vines and overgrown shrubs and trees on the premises. For example, one thing that's unique to Hagerstown is we have a lot of alleys.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we do.
Yeah. So oftentimes one of the big concerns that we have to address is the overgrowth into the alley. And sometimes people, they use their front. They don't always go out back unless they park there. But if they never go out back, they never see what goes on. But therein that responsibility lies with them. So really this is lots of information, but basically the message is that we want to keep our lawns mowed, the sidewalks free from any grass growth, and remove any vine growth, and maintain the trees and shrubs on the property. Time doesn't really allow us to get in all the codes as it pertains to trees and heights and things like that. But basically just keeping everything maintained, and again really focusing on removing any vine growth, maintaining the trees and shrubs on the property. And these last two were recently added into our local code so that we could maintain a consistent curb appeal in our town. And it's also to meet what we call the CPTED standards. And if you're not familiar with that, it's crime prevention through environmental design. If you remember at the outset, we were talking about how in medieval times they would cut the grass so they could see intruders coming. Mm-hmm. Well, those types of designs are built into development. So the landscaping, shrubs and things, they take into account because, say, for example, you had tall grass or overgrown shrubs by design, what perfect hiding places for criminals or thieves. So it's just to mention, to keep everything, visible in that respect. And this will be a topic discussed in a later Hub-Bub podcast. And we might clarify something as well when it comes to shrub growth. We are concerned about shrubs that grow into the sidewalk that impede the right-of-way and so forth, public travelways. It really doesn't allow us to address just shrubs in general on property, because what can happen is, just like the grass gets out of control, say on a vacant property, the bushes can too. Well, we're really not in a position to address the shrubs like we can the grass. So just something to keep in mind, because we do, from the citizens, get concerns about those. We just wanted to make everyone aware of that.
Cool. That's a lot of great information. And kind of follow up on some of these unique places that weeds grow. Let's talk about like paper alleys or streets where typically responsible for these no-man lands. Who is responsible for that? Usually it's the abutting property owners who are responsible for those paper alleys. And a paper alley or a street is a paper alley that exists on paper but never improved. So meaning the property owner next door has to cut this grass or trim the tree over that street. So how about water courses such as creeks, streams, and lakes? Here in Hagerstown, the abutting property owner is to maintain these areas as well. This is all vegetation, including trees and weeds, to the center line of any and all water courses or the edge of the water on streams which are normally flowing. And so what if there are acres of land? Does it all have to be mowed? Well, in Hagerstown, you don't have to mow all of the land. Where there's a large tract of undeveloped land adjoining the opposite side of the said unimproved right-of-way, the abutting property owner is then only responsible for maintaining 6 feet of the right-of-way from their common property line. So it's interesting.
Yeah.
So a nuisance weed can be abated. Who pays for this work? Everything always varies from jurisdiction, but typically if a property owner did not take responsibility and mow their lawn, the local jurisdiction can send a bill to the property owner for the work performed, along with any administrative fees, and at times fines may be issued. And if fees are not paid, then they are liened against the property, and once they are liened, the taxes will be higher for your property that year. So it's very important just to take care of your weeds.
Yeah, and we don't necessarily like talking about that, and we definitely don't like taking that step. We do find ourselves, I know I do, and many of us do, try to go the extra step to try to help people.
Yes, work with people.
Yeah, because, that's just a bad experience. We want to try to avoid that. Do we have to do it? Yes, from time to time, but we would rather avoid that, and that's why we're here today, just to kind of educate the public, what to expect. But again, the takeaway from all of this is just if you're a property owner, taking care of the things that you mentioned, and keeping, we might even add the sidewalks too, free from growth. That's part of that as well. Not unusual for grass to grow up in sidewalks, so maintain that as well. But we also understand this, that not everybody is physically in a position to do that. For example, we have a lot of older citizens in our community, and we try to work with people the best we can. And so know that if you're in a position where you're not able to do it because of your physical circumstances, just let us know. Mm-hmm. We'll be happy to work with you, and we won't just stop there, but what we will do is we will get in touch. Either we will, or we'll help you get in touch with your local organization that can give you the assistance that is needed. We would rather have someone call us and explain rather than not call at all, because if we don't hear from anybody, we don't know what's going on.
Right. We just move forward with how we usually move forward with things. But if you let us know that you're having issues or just need help or need an additional day, that's what we're here for. We want to work with you. And
Yep. So because our time for compliance is very small with grass, because it grows so fast. It can be as little as 3 days. It can be at the most 7 days. So again, like Donnie said, say you get a notice on Thursday or Friday and you're working, you can't get to the weekend. Let us know. We'll come back on Monday.
Right.
But just let us know. Our phone number, our contact information is right there. Just give us a call and we'll work with you. But again, the whole focus of this, it's about the community. It's about keeping the community looking good, keeping it safe, a healthy environment, and that's our goal as a department to uphold, to achieve that goal, and we want to work with everybody to do that.
Very good. Awesome stuff. All right, so now it's time for our weird news story.
All right.
All right, so this one is the Leaning Tower of Dallas. I think if you're watching us on YouTube, you'll see a picture of the Leaning Tower here. But what happened was in Dallas, there was an implosion, and this building, it kind of reminds people of the Leaning Tower of Pisa in Italy. So if you can picture that, the building's just kind of leaning there. It's kind of crazy, I'm sure so much time has went into planning for something like this and just did not go as planned. So just kind of crazy, but we did get an update that the tower is now down. So just goes to show you can plan as much as you want. It may not go according to plan.
That is for sure.
just want to give everybody, let you know that you can follow us on our social media platforms. We are on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. You can search for us by searching for City of Hagerstown PCAD. You can also find the Hub-Bub Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Anchor, and most of your favorite podcast players. And also, if you're just listening to us and you want to see our faces, we do have a YouTube channel. You can search for the Hub-Bub Podcast on YouTube, and we'll be the top listed results there. So yeah, look us up. Give us a rating on our podcast. Let us know how we're doing.
Yeah, just to echo what you said, we really would like your feedback, because we try to offer information to everyone that's going to be helpful for the community. Everything that we do is designed to equip those of you who live in our community so that you know what's expected, and not caught off guard with the codes and things, and how we can be a better service. So please provide the feedback. If there's something that you would like to see us talk about on our podcast that you wanted the answers to, please let us know, or anything that we can do to improve. We would certainly appreciate it. We won't look at it in a negative way at all. So, well, that being said, this month, the month of March, is National Music in Our Schools Month.
Okay.
Yeah. So, as those who have been watching our podcast, at the end of every episode, we feature a musical guest, and that's important. Music is important. So many resources will say that music stimulates the brain, and studies show it improves in all areas of academia. So it's a very positive thing. It stimulates all parts of the brain, and just kind of adds a quality of life. So right here in Hagerstown, we of course have the Barbara Ingram School of Arts. They have some music program there, and so look them up too. But just keep that in mind. So with our featured musician this month, a very talented guy. Sometimes I don't hear about these people till I hear about them, because I'm seeking them out to try to find them, to really showcase them. And this guy, you actually referred to me.
Yeah, I've been following his stuff for years, and he finally put out his own solo music. And so I gave this to Sean. I was like, hey, look him up, see if you want to feature him in the podcast. And I'm glad we are, because I really enjoy his music.
Yeah, check this guy out. His name is Roland Lewis. Now, he works full-time in Hagerstown. His family's been here. He loves working here. And a beautiful songwriter. I would describe his music as very kind of poetic, I guess.
Yeah, I'd say that.
Yeah, some nice harmonies. One website kind of wrapped up describing him. It said, borrowing from his memories made and dreams yet to be realized, American singer-songwriter Roland Lewis lyrics ease anxieties with beats of introspective melodies. Gentle on the ear, poignant to the heart, these songs are what you play when you're down, and the artists you turn to when in need of a reliable narrative.
Couldn't have said it any better myself.
Well, I couldn't have read it any better. But anyway, one thing that stood out with him too is his videos. You can find him on YouTube. I mean, Facebook. He's on Facebook, Spotify, iTunes, Amazon Music, Google Play. Check out his videos on YouTube. Some amazing videography. Even features family members in his video. So, yeah, check this guy out, Roland Lewis. Now, before we go out with our musical artists here, Roland, just want to encourage everyone to look out. April 1st, we're going to have a bonus episode of the podcast. Right now, the census is getting ready to, they're ramping up to get ready to do that. And there's a lot of, sometimes people have apprehension with the census. There's some myths, there's facts, right?
Right.
So our Hub-Bub Podcast on April 1st is when it will show. And we're going to talk with the director who is in our area managing the census and making sure that it gets done in our area. And so she's going to be able to kind of share with the facts about the census, what it involves, and it's going to be very, very informative. So we encourage you to look forward to that, again, April 1 on the census. All right, Donnie.
I think this is it.
Yeah, so let's take us out listening to Roland Lewis.
Hush my troubled mind and rest. Shut my eyes and dream of things I could have done much differently. Wait for me now. I might come around, I might come